Hello, everybody. I think actually my short talk fits quite well with Tom's because I'm taking a case study which illustrates some of the points that he was making. Last year, about this time last year, I made a trip to the Brazilian Amazon, to the state of Pará. I just managed to squeeze in before lockdown. And I and a Brazilian colleague, we visited a series of bauxite mines in the state of Pará. We were looking at mines that were opened at different times, at different decades, and we wanted to look, among other things, about whether or not the mining had become less harmful. Certainly the rhetoric of the mining companies is much more sustainable, much more friendly to the communities. And what does this mean on the grassroots? So the first mine we visited was Mineração Rio do Norte, which is on the Tombetas River, which is a tributary of the Amazon or up to the west of Pará state. It was set up in the 1970s during the military dictatorship, a very remote area, and the company arrived. And the first thing it did was to set up a company town. And this is an enclave, and it still exists today. It's an area which is inaccessible to the local population. And within the enclave, you have decent housing, supermarkets, cinemas, sports facilities, health service, schools, and all the surrounding population is excluded. It is a system of apartheid. And the people who live outside the enclave, when the company arrived, they were living much as traditional populations have lived for hundreds of years. They fished, they carried out small scale agriculture, they hunted, and they had a strong community life. But even the time when the company arrived, many were beginning to feel that they were excluded by the Brazilian state. They hadn't got schools, they wanted health posts. And the company more or less promised that it would help them be integrated within the progress of Brazil. But at that time, the company did not deliver on any of these promises. And the people began to feel very strongly the negative impact of the arrival of the mine in their community. There were a lot of evictions, and the company didn't even warn the people, just came in and evicted them. And when they started the mine, they discharged the waste without treating it at all into the rivers. Can we have picture one? It doesn't matter if is somebody going to show my pictures, or doesn't, never mind. This picture is a Batata lake, and it's a lake not far from the mine. And the photo was taken some time ago, and it's just covered with an orange sludge. Oh, here it is. It's this one here. The company said this sludge wasn't toxic. It didn't hurt the local community. It may not have been toxic, but it killed life in the rivers because it was so thick that no fish could survive. The people had to drink this water. They began to feel ill. And eventually, the president then, who was a military general, visited, and he determined that the company had to start treating the waste from the mine before it's put it into the rivers. And when we were there last year, it didn't look like this, but the community still complained that the water didn't taste right, that it was still having an impact on their health, and there were very few fish. And I think one of the things that became very clear was the contrast between this big mining company, an extremely rich mining company that came in. Could we have picture two? Next. This is one of the carriers of the bauxite ore, which day and night you've got these big boats coming up to the mine, being loaded with bauxite, and off they go. And on the very opposite side of the river to the mine, there's a large community of people who were evicted from their lands, people who have moved to this region because they've heard there might be jobs. And really, it is like a favela. We spent a night there, and I was amazed on the, I mean, it's literally about 80 meters from one of the richest mines in the world, and the people there haven't even got sanitation. I mean, there's no toilets in the community, and there must be something like 1,000 people living there. And now the really dramatic contrast between the wealth of the mine and the poverty of the people is causing a lot of discontent. The local people are feeling increasingly excluded from what's going on from the rest of Brazil, and they're getting worried about what's going to happen when the company leaves, because they know very well that in 15, 20 years, all the bauxite will be ended, and they will be exhausted, and they will be left with shattered livelihoods and a devastated ecosystem. And they're beginning to ask, how are we going to reconstruct our lives? And so I think this sort of shows very dramatically how the awful impact that a big mining company can have on a local region. So then we moved on to another mine that was set up by the big US mining company Alcoa in 2000. And Alcoa arrived with a very different rhetoric from Mineração Rio do Norte. At the time, Alcoa had been heavily criticized in the US for the impact of their mines on the environment, particularly on wetlands. And they were determined to change their image. They were going to have better relations with the communities. They were going to mine without pollution. They would help the community with schools, with health centers. So how has this worked out? There have been advances. There is no apartheid. The Alcoa didn't go in and set up a company town. They lodged their employees in the local town, Juriti. They have promised jobs, schools, and health centers to the local residents. They have delivered some of this. And in return, they have got the support, I suppose, of a majority of the people in Juriti. But from the beginning, there was strong opposition from a little community, Juriti Velho, which is about 20 kilometers away, where Alcoa was planning to set up its first mine. And the people there didn't want the mine. They'd seen the harm that the Mineração Rio do Norte had caused. I mean, social movements had taken them to the Trombetas to see what harm had been done by the mine there. And they didn't want it. I mean, Alcoa, when it arrived in the region, had promised compensation to all the families were affected, but it refused to accept that the people that lived in Juriti Velho qualified for any compensation. And it's interesting because it was partly a cultural clash. I mean, the families in Juriti Velho didn't have titles to their land, but I mean, very few traditional families in the whole of the Amazon basin have titles to their land. They've occupied their land, and the Brazilian government has only given land titles to a few, but this does not mean that these families don't have rights. By the time Alcoa arrived, Brazil had a form of democratic rule. It returned to democratic rule in 1985. And I think this is more important. They had a new progressive constitution passed in 1988, which recognized the rights of traditional people. But Alcoa just didn't get this. For them, the families didn't have land titles, so they were squatters, and they could get rid of squatters. They didn't have to pay them any compensation. And the community in Juriti Velho resisted. 1,500 people decided to blockade the headquarters of Alcoa, a huge imposing building, in January 2009. The picture 3 is of Gleicy, who was one of this woman. She was one of the people who took us round, and she was one of the extremely courageous leader during this blockade. Alcoa sent out hundreds of security guards. They surrounded the protesters, and Alcoa could have crushed them, but the people made it clear they would resist, and it's likely some people would have been killed. I mean, during the military dictatorship, if this had happened with Miração Rio do Norte, they would have gone in and they would have evicted the people and killed some. But times had changed by the year 2009. Brazil had a democratic government. There was more discussion, more debate. And the Workers' Party, as it happened, controlled the municipal government, state government, and the federal government. And although a lot of us were quite critical of what the PT did when it was in power, it did give some support to these protesters. And fortuitously, the World Social Forum was being held in Belém, just down the river. And they sent enthusiastic messages of support. They broadcast to the world what was going on. It went into the international press, and Alcoa decided to back down. It sent in one of its top executives, the CEO of its Latin American operations, and he went up to the communities and the protesters and said, "How much do you want?" And the protesters replied, "We don't want money, we want land titles, and we want to share in your royalties." And he backed down. He gave them all that. It was a victory, but it was only partial because the Girati Velho couldn't stop the mine. It's a huge mine. The next picture shows me. I think you get a bit of an idea of the scale of it. It's me in the mine, occupying the Alcoa, a Brazilian who runs the mine, and it's huge. The communities there are still suffering impact on the water, on the fish, on the game. Hundreds of livelihoods have been affected, and in some cases destroyed. And if we go on to the next picture. And because I think in a way this encapsulates what I've been saying. We talked to these two men in this picture, and both of them, before the mine had arrived, had earned their living by gathering Brazil nuts in the forest and selling them. And when the mine arrived, they were paid some compensation, but they were evicted. They had no livelihood. So now they earn their living in collecting rubbish in Girati Velho. And among the rubbish we noticed were some aluminium cans. So the whole process has come full circle. So I'm wondering, I think I better stop. I mean, we can discuss, I'm wondering what lessons we can learn from these two experiences, but it's probably better if we discuss that in the session later.